He was the kind of boy people often overlooked, not because he wasn't kind or interesting or worthy, but because the world rarely pauses long enough to see what's beneath the surface. His name was Caleb. He had soft eyes that hid storms, a gentle smile that masked loneliness, and a voice that people rarely heard. Not because he couldn't speak, but because no one ever really listened. Caleb wasn't born into luxury, nor into chaos, just the kind of quiet middle ground where people exist but are rarely remembered. He lived with his mother, a woman who worked 3 jobs and still came home with empty hands, and a little sister, Lily, who thought her brother was the strongest person alive. Caleb had always been a dreamer. While other boys played football or chased popularity, he scribbled poems in his notebook, wrote letters to the future, and stared at the stars like they were old friends. He didn't fit in at school. Too quiet, too sensitive, too different. The bullies noticed, of course, they always do, and every day became a new excuse for them to remind Caleb he didn't belong. They'd trip him in the hallways, tear pages from his notebook, whisper cruel jokes when he passed. Teachers looked the other way. Friends? He didn't have many. Most kids were too afraid to be seen standing next to him. But Caleb never fought back, not because he was weak, but because he believed people could change. That maybe, just maybe, kindness could soften cruelty. Then came Ava. She transferred to Caleb's school in the middle of junior year. Confident, smart, loud in the best way. The kind of girl who walked into a room and made everyone turn. But for some reason, she noticed Caleb, sat next to him in class, asked him questions, laughed at his quiet jokes. For the first time in his life, someone saw him, and it changed everything. They started walking home together, talking about music, life, fears, dreams. Caleb fell fast. And who could blame him? For a boy who had been invisible all his life, love felt like sunlight after years of winter. He wrote her poems, stayed up all night texting her, listened to every word she said like it was scripture. And then, she kissed him. It happened after school, in the rain, under the same oak tree where he used to sit alone. It wasn't planned, it wasn't perfect, but it was everything. That night, he couldn't sleep. Not because he was nervous, but because he finally felt real. Loved, chosen. But love, as Caleb would learn, is not always kind. A few weeks later, everything shattered. He came to school one morning to find copies of his poems, private, personal poems, pinned to lockers with cruel captions. Lover boy, poetry freak. People laughed, pointed, and there, standing with the crowd, was Ava, smiling, not kindly, not nervously, but cruelly. As if the whole thing had been a joke, a dare, a game. And Caleb was the punchline. He didn't go to school for days. His mom didn't understand, too busy trying to keep the lights on. Lily asked why he wasn't smiling anymore. Caleb didn't answer. Because how do you explain betrayal to a child who still believes in fairy tales? But the worst part wasn't the bullying. It wasn't even Ava's betrayal. It was that he believed it was his fault, that maybe he was too much, too emotional, too trusting, too Caleb. Depression crept in like fog, quiet, steady, suffocating. He stopped writing, stopped eating, stopped talking. Nights became endless loops of thoughts he couldn't shut off. Why me? What did I do wrong? Will I ever be enough? One night, he sat on the rooftop of his building, looking out over the city lights. Not because he wanted to end anything, but because he wanted to feel something, anything. The wind, the cold, the possibility. He whispered, "I just wanted to be loved." And that's when Lily found him. She didn't scream, didn't cry, just sat next to him, legs dangling over the edge, and said, "I love you, you know? Even if nobody else does, you're my hero." Those words, they saved him. Not in a dramatic, movie ending kind of way, but enough to make him get down, enough to make him breathe. The next few months were hard. He started therapy. Slowly, uncomfortably, began writing again. Not poems this time, but letters. To Ava, to the bullies, to himself. Letters he never sent, but needed to write. And each letter peeled away a little more pain. He learned that sometimes the people who break you were broken long before they met you. That love isn't always real, but healing can be. That being sensitive isn't a weakness. It's a superpower in a world that teaches boys to be tough instead of true. Years passed. Caleb graduated, went to college, studied psychology, wanting to help kids like him. Quiet, lost, full of invisible wounds. He published his first book at 24. A collection of letters, poems, and reflections titled "To the Boy Who Felt Too Much." It went viral. People saw themselves in his words. He got emails from strangers saying, "Your story saved me." And one day, Ava messaged him. She apologized, said she was young, stupid, pressured by the wrong people. Caleb didn't reply, not out of bitterness, but because he had already forgiven her. He had moved on, not just from her, but from the belief that her love validated his worth. Now, he speaks at schools, tells his story, shows his scars, not to gain sympathy, but to give hope. Because somewhere out there is another Caleb, sitting alone, wondering if anyone sees him. And he wants that boy to know, you're not invisible, you're not too much, you're not alone. So if you ever feel like the world doesn't see you, remember Caleb. Remember that even in the darkest moments, the smallest voice can echo the loudest when it's honest. And sometimes, the people who break you aren't meant to destroy, but to show you how strong you truly are. Because being broken isn't the end, it's the beginning of becoming whole. And love, real love, it starts with loving yourself.